for some Bengals news. At the Growler, we got you. Hot takes, interviews from your host, Paul Dano Jr.
All right, welcome into the latest edition of Rewatch Reaction. I'm Paul Dano Jr., the Athletic. My guy, Charlie Goldsmith, here with us. What's up, buddy?
Paul, I would like to start with a trivia question as we start this non-Trey Hendrickson defensive line breakdown.
All right, trivia right off the top. I love it. You're coming in hot.
What is Sheldon Rankins' sack celebration?
Is it a pelvic swirl?
No, but I like it. I feel like that fits the theme.
Yeah.
No, it is a shoulder shimmy into a flex, and we only saw that once. And I was surprised. I had no idea until I saw on tape that, that's what Sheldon does after he gets the sack.
and that begins the beginning of the end of talking about Sheldon Rankins in a Bengals uniform and a defensive line show. Well, I love it. That is what we're going to do today. We've kind of teased it all week. We are going to be doing a rewatch of the Bengals defensive line. Really, the biggest area that needs overhaul, that needs evaluation of what they actually have, what they need to be, what they need to go get, who's actually good, whose production was fake. There is a lot to talk about there. And so we decided that this will be the week that we were going to dive in fully to the defensive line. And there's a bunch of different ways that we could go. I'll ask you, Charlie, as I always do, where'd you start?
With this one, I started with the numbers, and I didn't, we'll go through a lot of film as well. And there's some specific, interesting details to parse through there. But two stats to me sum it up. One, when the Bengals were in base defense this year, which often for them was their, 5 defensive line front, the Bengals had the worst rush defense in the NFL, the worst. When both sides got big, when it was ground and pound time, they just got bullied and bulldozed and every synonym and, synonym that you could think of. The Eagles game was the best example, and I know the Eagles are this incredible, rushing attack, but that's the standard. That's where the Bengals are trying to go. That's the team they're trying to face. And when they got the ball back after that Joe Burrow interception, man, they loaded up and they made the Bengals look like a college team in that game, and that sets a lot of the groundwork for what went wrong on that side against the run. And then against the pass. When you just look at the plays where the quarterback was under pressure. So you did the hard part, and the Bengals didn't do a lot of pressuring the quarterback this year. But when you got the quarterback under pressure, the Bengals were 31st in the NFL in EPA per play per pass. So when you got pressure, they were doing absolutely nothing with it. There was no feel. There was no, heating up quarterbacks. That wasn't happening. They were also the worst defense in the league at turning blitzes into sacks. So a lot went wrong. When it was time to get big, when it was time to get home, the Bengals defense just did none of that all season.
And, we came into this season kind of knowing some of this, right? Like there was a lot of projection in there. There was a lot of hope. And, the shimmy into flex from Sheldon Rankins was supposed to be a big part of this, a $13 and change $1 million part of this that didn't. And a lot of that. So when you start talking about, well, why did pressures not turn into sacks? I think a lot of it is the fact that a lot of those were just because there was pressure from one spot. I mean, you watch, look around these teams that were playing this past weekend. I mean, it's guys coming from everywhere, right? I mean, pressure comes from all over the place, and just the inability to have more than one hurt them. But I also thought I dove a little bit into some of the numbers. I was like, I didn't feel like they were always exposed on 3rd and long this year. That didn't feel like the lack of pressure, and it wasn't. They were middle of the pack, which is good for this defense. They were middle of the pack on 3rd and longs, and they were even okay on 1st and 10s, but they still gave up a ton on the ground. 2nd downs, they were awful, and a lot of it was just 2nd down runs, right? Like, and they would just they would get moved, or it would be an explosive or whatever. They had the worst defensive success rate on 2nd downs in the league. They didn't get to 3rd and longs, right? They couldn't get to that advantageous down. They were 4th fewest 3rd and longs that they could force on the season. Like they couldn't do that. And that comes from getting moved. from the line just getting moved. And they too consistently couldn't hold the point of attack. And that went across the board into a number of projections that didn't pan out.
So where I go to too with that is like my whole philosophy on defensive football is when you get to where the Bengals are trying to go, it's can you create 5 splash plays that win you the game? Like, the Rams against Sam Darnold was a perfect example of this. The defensive line got home a couple times. Maybe you get obviously they got picks in that game. That's how you do it. That's the formula. And this Bengals defensive line outside of Trey Hendrickson, splash plays were the weakness of the group. BJ Hill is I've called him, I've through this exercise, dubbed him a volatile singles hitter. Just for size, great chasing you down, but from a splash play, quick trigger, it isn't making that happen. McKinley Jackson, probably their best splash play guy of this group. Kris Jenkins, a good one-on-one shedder who is, I call him like a leg press guy. Like he's very strong, kind of doing his role, but he had a very, not alarming, but kind of alarming lack of true backfield production this season. Myles Murphy, that was the story of his season, the lack of splash plays. There was some promising stuff, but then there was no finish. So it's a collection of players who aren't, finishing in those plays. And that leads to, not being in 2nd and 12. It's always 2nd and 6, and then it's 1st down, and you don't get to 3rd and long. And from an individual perspective, we could talk about each guy individually and that being the story of their season. And then collectively, of course, it's the same.
Let's start with, I think, the two most interesting people in terms of what's next for the Bengals defensive line are the two young high draft picks that are there. And that's Myles Murphy, who's been confounding through 2 seasons, and Kris Jenkins, who I think it was, what do you have here? You saw so many moments where it felt like he was just overwhelmed at the point of attack and his size really showed up. And then you saw some moments where you would see some hope and maybe there is something here. What did you see? What did you see from Kris Jenkins? Let's start with him.
Kris Jenkins, there's a vision there, which is a guy who kind of at a 3-tech spot is going to be to use a baseball analogy, a plus side platoon player in terms of a guy who plays the bulk of the snaps because of his ability to shed one-on-one and your trust with him in those situations, maybe even to make some plays out of light boxes. And there are examples of that as well. But Kris Jenkins gave the Bengals nothing as a pass rusher this year. Kind of what I saw on tape was even more concerning than the production overall. There was one play against the Eagles where, all season, when he tried to do pass rush moves, there was no plan. There was no, he doesn't have a move like, BJ grabs guys by their shoulders and sheds them to the side. Like Kris doesn't have that yet. So I feel very confident in Kris playing a nice amount of 1st and 2nd down snaps next season on this Bengals defense. He needs to become a pass rusher and have a threat of a pass rusher to really become a true, complete, versatile overall defensive lineman. He has a higher floor, a guy who I expect to be playing snaps for the Bengals next season, but a long way to go to figure out is he going to be a role player, obviously replacing BJ Hill as the vision, or can he be a true core piece of this defense? That'll come down to the pass rush.
Replacing BJ Hill will not be easy. BJ Hill had a more productive season than people probably realize in terms of consistent play. I think he played like BJ Hill, and that makes sense if you've watched the Bengals since he's been there, right? Like that's like, I don't think he was what you want him to be. He was himself. And it's just there was not enough other stuff happening around him to really make him fit. He fits nicely into his role, but you've got to have he's not going to carry you, right? And that's fine. Like you need a bunch of those guys. Jenkins, let's bring in a play here that you have. So if you're not following us on our YouTube channel, please go to the YouTube channel, the Growler Podcast. And you can watch a few of these plays as we drop these into our conversation. But here's one of Kris Jenkins. This is in LA from the moon. It's a let me finally zoom in here at the end where I think, you get a little bit of a view of some of the stuff Jenkins can do.
Kris Jenkins, all of his run stops this year were within 0 to 3 yards of the line of scrimmage. And he was the only one who had anywhere close to that, to that stat being the case. This is a perfect example of light box matchup against the guard. Can you shed? Can you use your strength to fill and kind of clear some way for the linebackers as well? This ends up being a split tackle between BJ Hill and between Jermaine Pratt. I like his ability to press back guards. He's really good at tackling guys backwards and not giving up kind of those grimy yards. He establishes the line of scrimmage well. It's all kind of sturdy and foundational. Now, what he's not is Kris Jenkins. He's not a shedder or a separator who climbs kind of in a DJ Reader way across the line, tracks the play, finds the ball, and will bring you down with one arm. Like, there's not really that lateral range yet or that sizzle yet, and there's definitely not that production against double teams yet. But there were a lot of plays. I picked this one. The famous one was the goal line stand in Carolina, where he shows he's a guy who will finish plays with strong hits, make an impact in tight windows, and a good feel of how to kind of get where he's supposed to be and kind of do your job, as football coaches like to say.
Yeah. And I also think that some of that stuff, right, is going to be stuff that you develop. I mean, you're not going to show up and automatically be a game changer. You'd like to, I think, it's fair to say, have seen more from Kris Jenkins in year one. I don't think you saw anywhere near enough of what you hoped, considering his pick and his reputation as being from that Michigan polished leader type player. That said, I think what you're talking about is a lot of stuff that you pick up. You can pick up over time, the ability to understand setting up pass rush moves and how to work when you, because he has a challenge of, look, he doesn't have the size of a lot of those guys. He's not McKinley Jackson, and he can just make plays where he goes in there, and sometimes he can overpower NFL offensive linemen. I mean, that's not, he needs to be a technique guy in a lot of ways, and the technique in the NFL is different than the technique in college, and that's something that you can develop. I think there's a hope factor there with that. The other side of this, though, the Myles Murphy side of this, is where we talk about, I just think everybody looks at no sacks. And hey,
it's really bad. You have to have a sack.
Tough to miss, right?
It's literally like the 6 rings argument. It's like that's the only, but I do feel positively on Myles Murphy, but all you need to say as a counter argument is no sacks.
No sacks. Like none. When the other guy on the other side had 17 and a half. So that's tough. I don't think it's as bad as no sacks, okay? And I know that's because no sacks sounds really bad. I don't think it's that dark. I also think that he's never going to be the guy that you thought you drafted. And I think the answer is more in the middle. And I think that's okay, because they need something out of him. I mean, it's so critical at this point with where they're at defensively. Whoever comes in next on the defensive line, or we talk about the next DC, that person at the top, one of the things at the top of their list needs to be, how can I make Myles Murphy play like a late second round pick? Right? Like, okay, I don't think he's a first round pick. I don't think he's an NFL first round end. Okay. But how can I make him play a little bit better? And you saw some of that. There's just clearly a disconnect for him from when he gets into his pass rush plan to get off of these guys. Like, he can move them, he can push them. You see the speed to power. You see a lot of the things you drafted and the traits. There's just no sense of how to get off of a blocker.
Well, Paul, he's a lead in pressure rate this year. He was, I believe, would have been 15th if he was a qualifying rusher. But that shows like something. Like, I wrote, like, he's very good at steering tackles in the right direction. And obviously the goal of, the whole pass rush thing is to shed the tackles. But he's very good at kind of establishing where he wants to go. He's very good at containing quarterbacks. His best trait is his speed. And, like, there are real examples of, like, when you see him turn on the jets and it's like, all right, most guys can't do that. That's true. But from a pass rush perspective in particular, so, like, BJ Hill kind of had one move last year. He grabbed guys by the shoulders, kind of toss, shed. Joseph Osai kind of had one move, dip, rip, kind of bend underneath. Myles doesn't have like a thing. Myles doesn't have a move, and that shows up with his overall confidence and his plan and his ability to separate and his ability to finish plays. He has to be bendier. He has to be a better ripper. He has to have more twitch. But overall, let's just find something he does specifically well as a rusher. Now, what that means for next year, like, it's funny. Like, I see him as a guy who you're kind of like a bad number 2 or a pretty good number 4 right now. I don't see him as a number 3, and we can talk about what I think of a number 3 defensive lineman or not. That doesn't matter. But, like, he's either a guy who, all right, he can do enough things well, kind of like the Reds going into next season with their outfield. Put him out there. Let's see what happens. Or it's, all right, we know where he's at. We don't want to give up on him. Let's have him in the number 4 spot. You'd like to see more against the run. He had very, very little except for one play against the run last season, and they didn't even give him snaps in the first place. But like, there are still tools there. It's just time to narrow in on things that he's specifically pretty good at.
Yeah, let's bring in one play here. This one against Baltimore. This is the home game against Baltimore here. And you see Murphy coming off the edge. And this is really as close to a sack as he got all season, right? I mean, this is an impactful third down play, chasing Lamar Jackson, forcing him to throw the ball away at the last second, winning against a starting right tackle and getting into Lamar Jackson's face, being the reason this play fails. Hey, when you don't have a sack, that counts. But this was arguably one of his best plays of the entire season.
And he had a few of them. So like, I went through all the pressures for all the guys, and I was like, all right, is this a good pressure, a great pressure, just kind of like you didn't really do much, but participation trophy pressure. And I had him on like 6 genuinely good pressures and 6 like kind of great pressures. Like, there were moments. There were like, what I love about this play specifically, like I was talking about earlier, is the chase down speed. So kind of waiting for the play to time up if Lamar Jackson wouldn't go through the audible right here. Todd Monken at work. All right, yeah, you have that power. That's what he does. He steers him back. This time he separates. I know he gets juked, but the ability to run stride for stride with Lamar is what makes that play. And that's kind of what can, if you want to talk yourself into it, give you some optimism of the overall athletic profile that Murphy you can talk yourself into, is just learning how to tap into. But kind of the problem is, like, what I view a number 3 guy is a true designated pass rusher who rotates in for your real pass rush downs. I don't think that's what Murphy is, and that's kind of a problem. But the tools here show that he is working with something. It's just he's never, again, like I'll keep saying with him, figured out what he does best in terms of harnessing that.
And that part of that can fall into coaching, I suppose. But I just feel like so much of defensive line and pass rush is you do it or you don't. Like, and that's why so much of the evaluation, you can take a shot at this pick, especially when you watch Nolan Smith go play for Philadelphia right now, and you can watch this pick and say, man, he didn't produce in college at the level you expected for his traits. That has to be focused on more when they are evaluating these picks, these defensive line picks. They've got to find guys that have more production on the college level.
Zach Carter had production.
Well,
sorry, this is a conversation for another podcast.
Yeah, none of it's perfect.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think when you're putting that kind of a chip on a guy and you're passing on Nolan Smith and Sam Laporta and some of the other people that were there in their conversation at that point, you got to be sure. And I don't, this was the concern. This is our concern, dude, is that when you're looking at Myles Murphy, you're saying, what if he continues to be the traits guy with no production? And I think that's what you've seen through 2 years. And I don't know that there's the reason I went over the top with Myles Murphy this year with my stupid 10 sack production that I continue to eat. Right. That's what I felt. I felt like you saw the flashes, and you've seen in history so many guys the light comes on in year 2, like that. The great pass rushers, you see it consistently. And I wasn't saying he was going to be those guys, but that's typically when you have traits guys, when they show some flashes in year 1 and they really take off in year 2. That's the typical trajectory. That's what makes this year so disappointing, because it feels like, okay, this was the trajectory. This is the year that it's supposed to turn on for you. The fact that it hasn't yet really brings in the path that it won't.
So here's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and you can kind of bring Joseph Ossai into this conversation as well. So something that the Bengals did that was very nice for us was the types of defensive ends they drafted. Like, it was so easy to pick. All right, it'll be one of these 4 guys. Like, literally, this is a true story. On Thursday night before the first round, we're having dinner, and I was talking about, Cedric Johnson's a perfect fit for a body type for what the Bengals look. And they drafted Cedric Johnson, and that was a win for me. But anyway, Myles Murphy was built in a lab for the speed, weight, length, size combination. And, I remember having this conversation with you when they drafted Myles Murphy. You were like, man, will they go off script? and get Nolan Smith, who was smaller than what the Bengals were looking for at that spot. So my question is, and again, Myles was built in the lab for what that version of the defensive end room was trying to be. New defensive coordinator coming in. Is it the same type of defensive ends that this scheme is built around on the edge? Are they willing to lean more into the speed route? Are they willing to lean more into the speed route specifically because of what that can do for their pass rush, which was terrible? Or are they looking at a model that like the Rams and Bills have followed, which is actually continuing to lean into size on the edge? Whatever decision that is with the new coordinator will go a long way to determining how many snaps Myles Murphy plays next season. Because if it's not the Myles Murphy body type that he wants on the edge, which again, he was built in the lab for what Lou's version of this was, well, and that's really bad for Myles Murphy. Also, this factors into like, are you willing to re-sign Joseph Osai or, an equivalent speed rusher to fill that role and probably trying to get better there? Well, it depends on the body type you're looking for at defensive end, and kind of we can keep going down this rabbit hole. What will shape the entire view of that position is, well, what does the new defensive coordinator have in mind for what his defensive ends are?
That's exactly the point that I've been making when people would ask, and I've answered this on a couple of different shows where it was like, well, could there be a scheme change, right? Could they gonna move 3-4, 4-3? Well, it's all kind of take it or leave it. The question is what you just said. The question is the scheme change would be a willingness to accept and lean into the smaller speed edge rushers that they have just refused to even look at. They won't even look them in the eye, right? Not going to do it. And so now there's an argument, I think, to be made for not doing it. When you look at the shift that the league made towards running the ball this year, and as the counter to what was what had been sort of happening with offenses and defenses in the passing game, and so many of these defenses getting a little smaller, employing more of these speed rushers, smaller linebackers. This is really the year where it most clearly shifted back to teams pounding that philosophy. Well, a DC is probably going to come in and say, I see this trend. I'm not going to go further into smaller guys when I don't have any of them here. Or maybe it is, you got to have one, right? You got to have one that you can send in there on 3rd and 9 to go rip the edge up. I think it's crazy to think that you don't want that club in your bag. I think that's like, to not be able to go to it on 3rd and 10 and have a guy. Give me a 3rd and 10 guy. Send me Carl Lawson or whatever,
great name.
On 3rd and 10 to go in there and eat and push your other edge rusher inside like they did with Osai a lot this year. Like, I think I just don't understand not wanting to have that versatility and that type of a card to play. That's all. And I think that's what you would maybe see from a new defensive coordinator. Nobody's asking you to live in it, but I think you got to be able to play with it.
That was part of the problem of this year's Bengals defense too. It was like, and I'm messing up this line, but like you keep replacing a hat with another hat. Like, all right, you have this type of safety that's struggling. Here's, Von Bell struggling. Well, here you just have young Von Bell in Jordan Battle, who that was the comp, right? He's the next Von Bell. Cam Taylor-Britt struggling. Who are you going to replace him with? Someone who has the exact same traits as Cam Taylor-Britt, because you keep drafting the same types of versions. And the defensive line room, specifically defensive end, was kind of the most similarity you had, between, traits between the guys going through the depth chart. Real quick, let's go through what this defensive end room will look like next year. So kind of your number one, Trey Hendrickson. Let's put off any trade. Either Trey Hendrickson or a guy you pay $9 million a year in free agency to replace Trey Hendrickson and lead that room as your number one. Number two is wide open. Kind of what I see there in my plan would be like a versatile big edge you get in the 1st or 2nd round, like a nice trait, strength, physical, captain, winner type, kind of stepping into number two. I think it's really important to get a real number 3 and to improve from the Joseph Osai spot. We kept talking about how you need more production, and it's hard to say you need more production and then bring back a guy who you needed so much more production from in Joseph Osai. So we can talk more about him if you want, but just some sort of overall designated pass rusher in that 3 spot. I think Murphy's a great 4 to have right now, and you hope you can grow him into more, but he can develop on your bench. He can fill in a couple different ways. And if he pops, and he'll take number 2 spot. And then with your number 5, are you bringing back Hubbard on a rework contract? Is that Cedric Johnson, which would be a DPR focus? Is that Isaiah Thomas, who's kind of that run stopping focus? Like, that depth spot will shape kind of what you're prioritizing your strengths are. Do you want another rusher? Do you want another run stopper? Kind of a developmental spot as a whole. That's kind of how I see that defensive lineman right now.
Yeah, I mean the edge room is pretty wide open. I think when you get past the, if you're counting on Hendrickson, which like you said, we'll leave that as yes. There's any number of directions. I mean, you could take, if you wanted to, you could take a big swing at a good edge on the opposite side if there was somebody available in free agency, or maybe it is the capital of your first round pick and throw them in there. I think that guy's got to play. If you go there and so it's hard, man. You gotta do it fast. If you're Myles Murphy, like, you're not gonna just keep getting and say, "Oh, I didn't really get opportunities." Well, you didn't do them enough with the opportunities that you had, and that leaves you in a spot where you're gonna have to fight this uphill battle right now. Like, there's not endless chances, and now you're gonna have a guy who's gonna be a coordinator who doesn't know you from Joe, so it's not gonna make any difference. I think there's gonna be some kind of, that feels like a free agent spot to me. I mean, the number 2 feels like you could go do a mid-tier get, a middle free agent in the like $7 to $10 million range that can go
like a Denico Autry type.
Yeah, let's go. Like, those guys are available every year, that have maybe some familiarity or particular fit for the system or whatever you feel like you're looking for, that can give you something, like just something reliable on the other side. There's just not anything. You need something reliable, and then you draft guys to play over top of them, or to rotate in, or to replace when they get hurt inevitably, or come in packages, and you're trying to replicate a Dunlap, Geno Atkins, Fisher Price package from 15 years ago, right? You need the young guys that come in sub packages and grow into bigger roles and kind of be that thing together. But I don't think you can do it without some reliability in that number 2 edge spot right now. And that's before we get into the fact that they need to throw more bodies on the inside too. And so it's kind of a mess, but I just think it's where you start with your free agent money. It's where you start with your top picks. Is they need to throw their best assets that they have available at those positions and just get something else, get something more reliable, and then draft for players to eventually play over top of those guys.
I mean, this all only works if you draft well, like, as we all know and as we've established. I love the idea of like throwing a lot of resources and bodies at the problem to make sure you have different types and different styles. Something with the draft specifically is you do have more access and avenues to more versatile players, in my opinion, through the draft and through free agency, because guys with specific combinations of tools just end up not hitting the free agent market in the first place. So a lot of different ways they could go. Definitely, as we've established a need, and kind of this in defensive tackle, I'm sure we'll in April be in fierce defensive end versus defensive tackle debates, because you can make all the same cases there as well, after a season where it wasn't nearly good enough.
Yeah. I mean, it can't be like, McKinley and Kris Jenkins, in the middle. Like, it can't be your answer. Or the other part of this was, we're having this conversation about defensive tackle, and I just wanted to point this out, and stopping the run and how bad that was. You mentioned them being last. How about, it's not that hard to throw a free agent body at this thing. Okay, let's look at some of the top run stop grades in the NFL, and you can think what you want to think about PFF grades. Generally, dudes that made plays. Okay, top and stop percentage, top and grade, whatever it is. Number 1, Calais Campbell was signed in July on a 1-year, $2 million deal. Number 3 was Poona Ford, 1 year, less than $2 million, by the Chargers. He was signed in the first wave of free agency. Tierra Tart was 17th. He was in your building. And I'm not here saying there was a lot of other reasons that Tierra Tart wasn't signed, and that's fine. But hey, he was in your building. If you were looking for answers, which you should have been, he was right here. Sebastian Joseph Day was 8th. 1 year, $4 million for the Titans. Malcolm Roach, a guy they were pursuing in free agency and didn't get. They didn't go after aggressively enough. He only signed 2 year, $7 million deal. He was 12th in the league in stop percentage. I mean, these guys exist, man. Like, this is not breaking the bank. These guys are here every year, especially run stopping it, like where it's not sexy, it's not 10 sack guy. You got to pay for that. These are the types of guys you should have been going after. You should have understood they needed more there, and they should have been more aggressive towards. And they need to learn that lesson and come back out after it this year.
Here's the problem, though. So, like, I think I've seen enough from Kris Jenkins to have him be a rotational 3-tech run stopper and base downs next year. I think McKinley Jackson is a backup nose tackle with upside. I would write those guys as your number 3 and your number 4 in that room. I mean, that's my opinion personally, and those are 2 lean run defense players over lean pass defense. So when you've got your 3 and your 4 accounted for, all right, your number 1 in that room, what I would do is I would prioritize in free agency getting a defensive tackle who could rush the passer. And then kind of for that number 2 spot, kind of similar to defensive end, a more versatile pick with, kind of those well-rounded traits that you can throw in and do a variety of things and develop. I don't like the idea of having, 1 or 2 being another run stopping guy. I think then you're just continuing to expose the lack of pass rush that they're getting for a defensive tackle. I think you've got to play Jenkins and Jackson. Like, I don't think either of them deserve to not play. So if you are trying to get like next year's Taylor Tart, all right, now that's your 5, and, I would really, and again, you have more resources and avenues to find run stopping defensive tackles in free agency than the draft, definitely. That was kind of the problem with going with Jenkins and Jackson. Why not? I guess they would have had to have traded up to be able to invest more in, one of those pass rushing defensive tackles that was available in that window of the draft. But you've kind of made your bed in terms of, all right, Jackson and Jenkins are your 3 and 4. You kind of do need, when you fill out this defensive line room now going into 2025, focus on the pass rush, because you've kind of already got the run defense resources accounted for. I don't think you can keep investing more resources into run defense at defensive tackle specifically with how bad the pass rush was. So you kind of are stuck and pigeonholed in some ways based on how they've already built that defensive tackle.
No, and this is why, and this, and then every single conversation that we have ends up in the same place. It's like, and this brings us back to T. Higgins, right? Like, right? 'Cause it's like, do you have enough money to do all these things you need to do on the defensive line and your guards on offense, and the T. Higgins money, and that feels very big and dries up quickly when you start talking about all these problems. And there's just only so many draft picks that you have and that you can throw at him, and then the percentage rate of actually hitting on those. So round and round we go. This is not a 1-year fix, is kind of probably the bottom line, I think, of this conversation. When you look at where they're at, they really have 1 starter, and he's in the last year of his deal, and he's turning 31. So as great as Trey Hendrickson has been, that's the one thing that they have. And they have 3 starters that they basically need to find or see magically develop. And maybe that happens. They're gonna, and that's where they need some help with a coordinator that can come in and maybe get more out of those guys and find ways to do that, which has kind of been the theme here. But they've got to get that figured out, and there's just a lot that they have to do because they don't have much that they can count on. After you look at this year and what these guys gave you, there's flashes, but there's nothing that you should be counting on right now to avoid this year happening again up front.
So this is like a core thing a core belief I have about where the Bengals are and where they're going. Like, sure, they'd love to win the Super Bowl next year, but I think a more realistic way to look at this is rebuilding the defense and rebuilding a defense that can grow and improve together. Like, no defense is ever optimized right when you bring your new defensive coordinator in, unless that's Vic Fangio. Like, how these things work is you learn the system, you get more confident in the system, you bring more players in who fit the system. I very much like looking at this almost linearly. Instead of trying to patchwork pieces and such, what can you do to optimize the growth of a collective by having like your young veterans, who can grow in the scheme on multi-year deals, having draft picks who fit. Like, I like the idea of building towards something, which does have me leaning younger over older on the defensive line. And then here's the last thing too, like, someone told me this in 2023, when you're paying your quarterback, you're going to have kind of the word hope positions was used. Like some years you're going to go into the season hoping Irv Smith is your answer at tight end. By the way, did you know Irv Smith was on the Texans and then he showed up and made like 2 catches? I did not know that.
I knew that he was on. I did know he was on the Texans because we were actually talking about him in the media room the day that he got signed. But I didn't know. I wasn't expecting him to be catching footballs.
And you're going to go into every year with hope positions. And, some years that might get sticky, and that's great. This year, kind of guys you're looking at for hope positions you're going to have to bet on like 2 of these guys with how you build your roster. You're going to have a hole and you'll be like, well, Myles Murphy's the plan to fix that hole. Well, Jordan Battle's the plan to fix that hole. Dax Hill's the plan to fix that hole. Eric All's the plan to fix that hole. Like over the course of the roster, there are going to be 2 or 3 of those spots this year. That's just the reality when you're paying, your stars as much as they are and as much as they will be. So who are those guys you can count on? Is it, maybe Cedric Johnson's their number 3 edge rusher? Probably not, but they might be in a spot where they get stuck from a resources perspective and just have to hope. And again, to keep circling back to this, that just underscores the importance of these draft picks with the limited resources they do have to improve this line.
Yep. There's no amount of draft picks that you could throw out. I'd just like, stop. That's enough. No, just keep drafting these guys, keep hoping that one of them hits. And they obviously have other needs, but I think that's going to be a big part of it when you have the amount of draft. At some point, that's the answer. And or it will continue to be the reason they fail, and that's sitting on Duke Tobin and Mike Potts' desk today as they get ready to go down to the Senior Bowl soon. So, on that note, Charlie, this was great defensive line dive. Look at us go. We were all the way in on it, and now we'll keep moving it forward, and there'll be a new defensive coordinator before too long here for us to talk about what they're going to do, the impact it could have on some other guys. Lots of different directions, plenty more tape, plenty more lists to go down and point out some of the sadness. But we're trying to spin it forward with hope, right? We're trying to. Doing our best.
I was reminded through this exercise that Lawrence Guy and Zach Carter played for the 2024 Cincinnati Bengals.
Yeah, don't forget that. Lawrence Guy, whose pants kept falling down, which is really unfortunate. It really was kind of the epitome of the defense in the
You
early
would think you would
season.
learn that by year 15. Got to keep your pants up.
Or you just stop caring. And you'll find this out, Charlie. When you get older, you stop caring as much. I think that's maybe part of what happened with Lawrence Guy. Well, make sure everybody is following Charlie on Charlie G on Twitter, 2 underscores after that. And you got to have the Substack, man. All this stuff, BJ Hill breakdown, the defensive line breakdown stuff that you did for this, all up there. Now make sure you're following. So follow on Twitter and make sure you're getting that. Sign up, subscribe. Charlie's got awesome stuff, as you know already, because you listen to this every single week. So, all right, Charlie, appreciate it, man. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Paul.
See you, bud.